The first time I realized America was winning the war was not when I saw their tanks, it was when it hurt to sit down. My name is Anna Vogel, and on October 22nd, 1944, I stepped off a cold army truck into the sharp wind of Fort Douglas, Utah, a 27-year-old German field nurse who still believed every terrible thing she'd been told about Americans. My hands shook as my boots touched the gravel, because I expected shouting, humiliation, maybe even a rifle butt across the face. Instead, the first thing that reached me was the smell of warm bread, beans and wood smoke drifting from a kitchen somewhere behind the barracks, a smell so gentle and ordinary that it felt strange inside a place meant to hold the enemy. As I stood there trying to understand what kind of prison smelled like supper, an American nurse walked up, placed a folded blanket in my arms and gave me a small smile. "You're safe here," she said softly, as if those simple words could undo years of warnings and fear. I did not understand her. None of it made sense. Just weeks earlier I had been working near Aachen, binding wounds in a field hospital torn open by artillery, listening to German radio insist that capture by Americans was worse than death. I believed them. I believed that the men who wore olive green were monsters who would treat us like animals. Yet now I was standing on American soil, after days of trucks and trains and a long grey crossing over the Atlantic, and everything around me, this clean air, this quiet order, this strange kindness, felt impossible. A guard guided me toward the women's barracks, a long wooden building with a stove humming inside. I moved slowly, still waiting for the cruelty I had been promised. My legs were stiff from the journey, and the deep bruise on my hip burned with every step. When I lowered myself onto a rough wooden chair, a sharp pain shot through me and I gasped without meaning to. A young American soldier noticed, said nothing, and simply slipped a small canvas cushion beneath me before walking away. That tiny act confused me more than all the rumours I had ever heard. I sat there, holding the blanket, feeling the cushion soften the pain just enough to breathe, and I realised that nothing in this place matched the world I thought I knew. If you want to understand why that small cushion hurt me more than any wound, we have to go back to the week before, to a field hospital collapsing under American shells. In the last cold week of October, near the ruined edges of Aachen, I was still working inside a field hospital that was little more than torn canvas and mud, a place where wounded men cried out while American artillery screamed overhead. I'd been awake for nearly 2 days, my hands stiff from wrapping bandages, when the shelling suddenly stopped, leaving a silence so sharp it made my heart pound harder than the noise. German radio had warned us for months that it was better to die than be captured by Americans, and I believed every word. I kept a small pistol hidden inside my coat, not to fight them, but to end my life if they came too close. When the first American soldiers reached us, I braced for shouting and violence, but they moved through the wreckage like practiced workers, lifting stretchers, checking pulses, and calling for more help with calm, steady voices. One sergeant with the name Miller stitched on his jacket knelt beside me, tried a few broken German words. "Bleib ruhig, you're safe now," but I did not believe him. Nothing in my mind could accept the idea that the enemy would treat us as anything but prey. They gathered the wounded and loaded us onto trucks, and soon I found myself inside a large barn that had been turned into a temporary holding area. There was straw on the ground, clean tin cups filled with water, and no guns pointed at us. An American searched my small bag, found only bandages, my Bible, and a letter from home, then handed everything back without a word. When I lowered myself onto a wooden bench, the deep bruise in my hip, left by a wall that had fallen on me during a bombing raid, sent a sharp pain through my side. A medic noticed my wince, said something to another soldier, and moments later a cushion made of canvas stuffed with straw was placed under me. I stared at it, confused. Why were they making it easier for me to sit when I'd been told they would make me crawl? That night, I lay in the cold barn listening to the wind push against the old boards and the soft rustle of straw as frightened prisoners shifted in their sleep. The air smelled of damp hay and fear, a mix that settled deep in my chest. I did not know what waited beyond the barn walls, or why the enemy had shown even the smallest mercy, but soon trucks would come again, and then trains, and then a ship heading west across an ocean I had never seen. I could not imagine then that the journey would end in America itself. The convoy that carried us west moved through a bitter landscape of broken villages, burnt chimneys, and fields covered in grey frost. the kind of country that looked as exhausted as the prisoners riding through it. I sat in the back of the truck with other women, each of us wrapped in silence, each of us waiting for the moment when the Americans would finally show the cruelty we had been warned about. But it never came, not on the trucks, and not on the train that took us farther toward the French coast. When we reached the port of Le Havre, a place the guards called Lave, I expected harsh orders and empty stomachs, yet the first thing handed to us was a tin cup of hot coffee and a slice of bread spread with butter. The steam from the cup rose into the cold air, and the warmth surprised me so much that I hesitated to drink it. Inside the train car, women whispered the fears we had all carried for years. Siberia, never see home again. But their voices faded as the unexpected smell of coffee drifted through the wooden slats. I sat by the barred window watching the soot-covered building slide past, waiting for a kick, a blow, any sign that the enemy would treat us as the monsters we'd been told we were. Instead, I heard an American guard behind me say quietly to another, "They're just kids," and for the first time in the war I realized someone on the other side saw us not as demons, but as frightened young women caught in events too large to understand. When we were marched onto a ship bound for America, the sky over the harbour hung low and grey, the sea matching its colour as long lines of prisoners shuffled across the deck. The ocean stretched out like a sheet of cold metal, and I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. Soon an American officer gathered us and read aloud from a document, the Geneva Convention of 1929, explaining that prisoners were entitled to food, shelter, medical care and fair work. I didn't understand every word, but two of them stayed with me. Protected and rights, words I had never expected to hear applied to people like us. The ship rolled steadily as waves slapped against the hull, and I held onto the railing looking at the long rows of captured soldiers and nurses around me. Some stared at their boots, some stared at the sea, and all of us were trying to imagine what waited on the far side of that grey horizon. As I watched the cold water churn, I understood dimly that we had already left the Reich behind, not just in distance, but in the way the world now treated us. We were stepping into a place where rules seemed stronger than hatred, even if I did not yet trust it. I thought the worst part was the voyage. I was wrong. The real shock waited on the other side of the ocean. The morning we reached America was wrapped in a thick white fog, so heavy that the coastline seemed to rise out of it like a quiet dream, with a lone flag waving above rows of warehouses and cranes that stood still against the grey sky. As we were ordered down the gangway, I braced myself for the shouting and blows I had been taught to expect, but the military police only spoke in short, even tones. "This way, line up, keep moving," without raising their voices or pointing their rifles at us. Inside the processing building, the air felt almost unreal. The sharp scent of soap mixed with hot coffee hit me so suddenly that I stopped walking for a moment, overwhelmed by the cleanliness of it all. A female doctor in uniform, the first I had ever seen, stepped forward to examine me. She checked my eyes and hands, looked for lice, and then placed a numbered tag around my neck marked with PW and Geneva. Before I could pull back, she offered a small, reassuring smile and said, "You're safe now, Fräulein," words I still didn't know how to believe. After processing, we were put onto a train heading inland. Through the barred window, I watched America unfold like a series of paintings. First green fields rolling out beneath a pale sky, then wide stretches of desert that shimmered in the sun, and finally mountains capped with snow standing silent and blue against the horizon. Somewhere along that long ride, a guard walked down the aisle, stopped beside me, and quietly handed me a red apple. I hadn't held a piece of fruit in months, and the cool weight of it in my palm felt almost unreal, a reminder of a world that had once been normal. When the train finally stopped, Fort Douglas came into view. Watchtowers at the corners, barbed wire tracing the fence line, and long wooden barracks arranged in neat rows. It was unmistakably a prison, but not the kind of place we had been taught to fear. As we marched past the buildings, I caught the warm smell of wood smoke, cooked beans, and fresh bread drifting from the camp kitchens, simple scents that seemed completely at odds with the fences around us. Inside the intake room we were given soap, towels, and uniforms marked PW, and an officer explained our daily schedule with the same calm precision I had seen since the moment we stepped on American soil. I stood there, holding the folded clothes, realizing that this place was built on order, strict, clean, and steady. And that kind of discipline was its own kind of power. It was a prison, yes, but a prison kept in a way I had never imagined, one that felt unsettling not because of cruelty, but because of its quiet structure. The real surprise wasn't the fences, it was what happened inside them. Life inside the camp settled into a rhythm that was strict but strangely human, nothing like the nightmares we had imagined. Every morning at 6 a bell rang, and we lined up outside the barracks for roll call, our breath rising in thin clouds against the cold Utah air. Breakfast was always the same: oatmeal, bread, and on rare days a scoop of eggs, and though it was simple, it was steady, something I had not known for a long time. After breakfast we were sent to our assigned jobs, and I was placed in the laundry, where the steam from boiling water filled the air as we washed sheets, uniforms, and sometimes even the clothes of the guards. For each day of work we were given small tokens, bits of cardboard stamped with numbers, and when I first held them in my hand I could hardly believe it. Prisoners earning money in America. It was unthinkable to someone raised under the Reich. Yet the canteen accepted them, and when I stepped inside for the first time, the shelves held jam, postcards, soap, and even chocolate. I chose a single chocolate bar, the first sweet taste I had had in months, and as it melted on my tongue I felt something loosen in my chest, some small reminder that life could still be gentle. The camp rules were strict but never cruel. No guard was allowed to insult or strike a prisoner, and no prisoner could lay a hand on another. Punishment meant losing canteen privileges or doing extra duty, not the beatings and humiliation we'd been taught to expect. When one woman was caught stealing bread, she simply lost her canteen rights for a week, and even the guard spoke of the matter quietly, as if determined not to shame her. Sundays were the strangest days of all. No bells rang. We washed clothes, wrote letters, or sat under the sparse trees behind the barracks, talking softly. In the evenings, guards locked the gates but never shouted "lights out." They simply walked away, leaving a silence that felt oddly respectful. One night, as we sang old German folk songs to pass the time, I noticed Sergeant Miller standing by the doorway, listening with his arms crossed. When the song ended, he shook his head slightly and said, "You sing like you're already free." I didn't know how to answer him, but the words stayed with me long after he walked off into the darkness. Slowly, I began to understand something that unsettled me more than any weapon could have. They controlled us with rules, not fear, and somehow that made their power feel stronger. But rules weren't the only thing that started to change me. Pain did too, a very specific kind of pain. The change in me began on an ordinary day in the laundry, when I bent down to lift a heavy, soaked sheet, and a bolt of pain shot through my hip so sharply it felt as if someone had pressed a hot iron into my side. I tried to hide the limp that followed, but a guard noticed and told me I had to report to the infirmary. Fear tightened my throat. In the Reich, anyone too injured to work was often sent away and never returned. But I had no choice, so I walked across the yard toward a low white building that smelled of soap, metal, and medicine, a clean and disciplined scent that made me feel even more out of place. Inside, a nurse named Ellen Moore greeted me. She was strict in posture but gentle in expression, and she motioned for me to sit before asking, "Where does it hurt?" I hesitated, but the pain forced honesty. A young army physician wearing round glasses examined me next, speaking through a translator as he pressed along my hip and asked questions. Then he ordered an X-ray. The word itself startled me. Back home, even civilians in desperate need rarely received such care. The idea that a prisoner, an enemy, would be given one felt impossible. Yet minutes later I stood in front of a machine humming softly, while the technician positioned the plates. When the image developed, the doctor pointed to a faint line on the film and explained that I had a hairline fracture from when a wall collapsed on me during a bombing raid. Not dangerous, he said, but certainly painful. Then he handed me a small bottle of penicillin. I stared at it, stunned. In Germany, people had died for lack of such medicine, one of my own patients among them, and now the enemy was giving it to me freely. The thought struck me harder than the pain ever had. The enemy's giving me the medicine my own country couldn't spare for its civilians. The next morning, as I walked slowly back to the infirmary for a follow-up, Ellen approached carrying a cushion made of canvas stuffed with straw. "To help you sit," she said simply. I eased myself onto it, and the relief washed through me so quickly that my eyes stung. It was such a small kindness, yet it broke something inside me, a wall I hadn't realised I'd built. That night, lying on my bunk, I held the bottle of penicillin in one hand and the cushion in the other, feeling the weight of both. I opened my small notebook, the one that had travelled from the ruins of Aachen to this strange new world, and wrote a single line: "They heal us while we fight them." From that moment on, the cushion became more than a comfort for my hip. It became a symbol I could not escape. Every time I sat on it, something inside me hurt in a way no medicine could soothe. The cushion made my body hurt less. The letters from home did the opposite. The first letters from Germany arrived on a grey morning after months of silence, and when my name was called, my hands shook as if the paper itself might burn me. I opened the envelope and saw my mother's familiar handwriting, thin and strained, and read the words again and again until they blurred through my tears. "The city is gone. Your brother is missing. Food is scarce. We are alive." I held the letter to my chest, feeling as if the walls of the barracks were closing in. The next morning I sat in front of my usual bowl of oatmeal, but every spoonful felt like swallowing guilt. Around me, the women whispered the same torment. "My children eat potato peels and I eat eggs here." The camp that once felt orderly now felt unbearably heavy, as if the silence itself accused us of surviving too well. Laughter vanished. The canteen stood half empty, and even the guards walked more quietly, as if they understood grief without needing to see the letters. One afternoon, someone left a small bag of apples at our barracks door with a note that simply read, "For your letters." No name, no explanation. Just a gesture that softened the edges of our sorrow. Later that day, Clara, the young translator, found me sitting alone outside. The air smelled of dust and pine, and I couldn't bring myself to speak. She sat beside me without asking permission and waited until I met her eyes. "Being alive still matters," she said gently. "Don't let the war take your heart too." Her words felt like a quiet hand steadying me in the dark. In the days that followed, more news filtered into the camp: Dresden in ruins, Berlin collapsing, Hitler dead, and finally the announcement that the war in Europe was over. The Americans did not cheer or celebrate. They lowered their flag halfway and kept the camp still, as if acknowledging not victory but the end of a long, painful burden. Something shifted among us after that. Some of the women began working harder, not because they were ordered to, but because giving effort felt like a way to repay the strange mercy we had been shown. As for me, I returned to the infirmary, this time not as a patient but as a helper. I carried water, changed bandages, cleaned tables, and wrote letters for those who couldn't write. The smell of medicine and soap no longer made me uneasy. Instead, it reminded me that I could still be useful, still give something back. And as I worked beside the nurses and medics, I realized that the kindness of the Americans had not made me weaker. It had forced me to grow, to confront truths I had once been too frightened to see. Then came the day the gates opened again, this time to send us home. When the trucks finally rolled out of Fort Douglas, the war felt strangely distant. We passed through quiet American towns where children standing on porches waved at us, not with hatred, not even with pity, but with a kind of simple curiosity that left me unsure how to react. I had expected anger from the people whose soldiers now guarded us, yet the world we drove through seemed peaceful, almost untouched by the destruction that had shaped every mile of my life until then. At the port, prisoners from camps across the country were gathered onto ships bound for Europe. The sea voyage felt heavier this time, not because of fear, but because I no longer knew what waited on the other side. When the coastline of Europe finally rose into view, the sight struck me harder than any shell I had heard in Aachen. The docks were in ruins, littered with broken beams and burned-out warehouses, jagged and black like a row of shattered teeth. Smoke drifted above the rubble, and for a moment I felt as if I were returning not to a continent, but to a grave. At the processing station, a German officer inspected my American-issued documents, frowned, and looked me over slowly. "You were well fed," he said with a cold edge. "You don't look like you suffered much." The words hit me like a slap, as if my survival itself were a betrayal. When I travelled back to my hometown, the devastation deepened. Streets I had walked as a girl were nothing but mounds of brick and ash. My family's house was gone, reduced to a pile of broken stone. The church where we once sang Christmas hymns had lost its bell tower, now standing half collapsed against a sky that no longer knew how to look hopeful. I found my mother living in a small shelter, patched together from bricks and sheets of tin. When she saw me, she touched my face gently and whispered, "You look healthy, thank God." But in her eyes I saw something else, a flicker of confusion, maybe even doubt, as if she wondered how someone who had been a prisoner could return stronger than those who'd been free. That first night we shared a thin blanket and she asked quietly about the camp. I told her only the simplest things, that there were rules, and food, and nurses who treated wounds, and even songs that filled the evenings. She listened without interrupting, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket, and when I finished, she said in a voice barely louder than the wind, "It sounds kinder than home." Those words frightened me more than anything that had happened in captivity. Kinder than home. I lay awake long after she fell asleep, thinking how strange it was that a prison across an ocean could feel gentler than the ruins of the world I'd grown up in. I thought my time as a prisoner was over. In a way, it had just changed shape. Back in Germany, I learned quickly that surviving captivity came with its own kind of burden. Many people in the village called former POWs like me the soft ones, their voices edged with bitterness. "You were fed by the enemy while we starved," they would say, as if safety itself were a crime. But soon the Americans returned, not as conquerors this time, but as builders. Their trucks rolled into the ruined towns carrying engineers, doctors, and aid workers. I watched them unload sacks of milk powder for children, draw chalk lines in the dirt to organise orderly food lines, and speak gently to frightened families. The same quiet discipline I had known inside the camp reappeared in the streets of my broken country, a kind of order that made survival feel possible again. By 1947, I found work as a translator for the Allied administration. I often sat in crowded meeting rooms where Germans and Americans argued over rebuilding plans. The air was always thick with suspicion. One afternoon, an older German man slammed his hand on the table and growled, "Why should we trust them? They bombed us." His anger echoed off the bare walls, but something in me refused to stay silent. I looked at him and said softly, "Because they also fed us." The room fell still. No one knew quite how to answer, but the truth hung there like a lantern in the dark. Over time, a small group of women, former POWs like me, began visiting schools and community gatherings. We became known as the Witnesses of Fairness, not because we praised the war, but because we spoke honestly about the strange mercy we had seen inside American camps. I would open my old notebook and read short lines. The nurse who eased my pain with a cushion, the cook who shared bread, the guard who said we sang like free people. I never retold the scenes in full, I only shared what they had meant. That justice and mercy could walk side by side, and that discipline could be gentle without becoming weak. Slowly, public opinion began to shift. People who once believed defeat meant only humiliation started to see that it had also offered lessons, hard, painful lessons, but necessary ones. As new schools opened and factories restarted, some Germans began to say quietly that perhaps rebuilding required not just bricks and timber, but a new way of thinking. And as I watched nurses treat children in the same steady manner American medics once treated us, I realised the truth that had lived inside me ever since Fort Douglas. The camp had not been only a prison. It had been a classroom. America had taught me justice, mercy, and discipline, the kind that rebuilds rather than destroys. And I carried that lesson, and that cushion, all the way into old age, all the way back to Utah. I returned to Utah many years later, long after my hair had turned silver and the war had faded into something younger people only read about. As I stepped off the bus and walked toward Fort Douglas, I hardly recognized it. The barbed wire was gone, the guard towers silent, and the old barracks had been turned into museum halls filled with sunlight instead of fear. Inside, I moved slowly past the displays until one photograph stopped me cold. A group of German women washing clothes, smiling faintly at the camera. There, at the edge of the frame, was a younger version of myself, tired, thin, but alive. Beneath the photo, a caption explained that more than 425,000 German POWs had lived in over 500 camps across America, all under the rules of the Geneva Convention monitored by the Red Cross. I sat down on a wooden bench to steady myself and a familiar ache stirred in my hip, the echo of a wound healed decades ago. In front of me, behind glass, lay a simple canvas cushion stuffed with straw. It might not have been mine, but the sight of it carried me straight back to 1944. The fear, the pain, the kindness, I didn't know how to accept. As I sat there, a young American visitor, perhaps a student, approached me and asked softly, "Was it hard to forgive us?" I looked at him, at his open face, at a generation that had only known peace, and answered the truth that had lived in me for a lifetime. No, it was harder to believe you had forgiven us. He nodded slowly, as if hearing something he had not expected. And now, speaking to you, Americans my age or older, men who lived through the weight of those years or heard the stories from fathers and uncles, I want to say this plainly. Your country came to Europe as conquerors, but you stayed as teachers. In a time when hatred would have been easy, you chose order, mercy, and a strange, disciplined kindness. You stayed human when the world around you was losing its humanity. Do not underestimate what your fathers and grandfathers did with a blanket, a bowl of soup, a cushion, and a law called Geneva. Those small acts rebuilt more than bodies. They rebuilt a broken faith. As I stood to leave, the late afternoon sun poured through the windows, lighting the old wooden floorboards the way it once lit the snow outside the barracks so many years ago. And I understood, finally and fully, the truth I'd carried across continents and decades. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs or its tanks, it was its mercy, and I am living proof.